The red pen went through my load calculations before I finished the sentence explaining them. It didn't circle. It didn't underline. It slashed, corner to corner, one stroke, and the paper tore a half-inch under the nib. 11 people sat around the mahogany table at Marlowe and Cole, and not one of them looked at me. They looked at her. Adair Voss set the pen down the way other people set down verdicts. "Your bracing tolerance is wrong," she said. By 4%. On a 140-story tower, 4% is a funeral. I had spent 6 weeks on those calculations. I had checked them at midnight and again at 5 in the morning, the way I checked everything, the way I had checked things since I was 12 years old, and learned exactly what happened to buildings that weren't checked enough. My hands were shaking under the table where no one could see them. My face, I hoped, showed nothing at all. "I'll revise them," I said. "You'll revise them tonight." She didn't raise her voice. She never raised her voice. That was the thing everyone said about the Iron Line, that she had never once needed to shout to empty a room of certainty. "And Miss Ashby, if you're going to guess at load tolerances, don't bring them to my table." Emery Cole, founding partner, silver-haired, smiling the way sharks are rumored to smile before the water changes color, folded his hands. "Perhaps structural should sit this one out going forward," he said, not to me. To her. About me, as if I were a chair that had been placed wrong. I gathered 11 pages of torn calculations and did not let my scent sour in front of them. It sat in my throat like a held breath the whole way to the elevator. If you want to see whether an ice queen with a torn page and a body that won't stop shaking ever gets her answer, stay a moment and subscribe to the channel, because this one earns it slowly and then all at once. My name is Wren Ashby. I was 27 years old, an omega in a field that still whispered the word like an apology, and I had wanted to build things that didn't fall down since the November afternoon my father didn't come home from a job site that a contractor had underbid into collapse. I was 12. I remember the compass in his tool bag, brass, one hinge already stiff, and I remember taking it out of the box they gave my mother and keeping it in my desk drawer for 15 years because it was the only thing of his that still had his fingerprints on the metal. I did not cry in the elevator. I counted floors instead. 41, 40, 39. By the lobby, I had my face arranged into the flat, careful nothing that got me through most days at Marlowe and Cole, where I had been for 3 years and promoted 0 times, where the associates called me the ghost because I moved through the halls like something already forgotten. Adair Voss had made partner at 29. She was 33 now and feared floor to floor, and the epithet had followed her out of 3 different firms before this one, the Iron Line, because her drawings never bent, and neither did she. What nobody said out loud, though everyone seemed to know it the way you know a house has a draft without finding the crack, was that Adair Voss had built her entire career refusing to be her mother's daughter. Eleanor Voss had designed half the skyline I walked under every morning until a corner-cut foundation pour on a project she'd signed off on failed during a storm and took her with it. Adair had been 19. She had spent the 14 years since triple-checking everything a person could triple-check, as if enough precision might reach backward through time and put a hand on her mother's shoulder before she ever signed that page. I didn't know any of that yet. Not really. Not the shape of it. I only knew she scared me, and I didn't fully understand why the fear didn't feel like the ordinary kind. 2 weeks later, I was on the Meridian site at 6 in the morning, alone, because I liked the building better before it was full of people who didn't see me. The tower was 31 stories up out of a planned 140, its skeleton still raw against the gray sky, and I was walking the north scaffold when I heard it. a low-groan, metal complaining under weight it hadn't been braced to carry. I had heard that sound before once, in a memory I kept sealed like a wound that never quite closed. Adair Voss was 40 feet up the scaffold, inspecting a weld, with her back to the joint that was failing. I didn't think. I ran. "Move," I said. Not a request. My voice didn't sound like mine. She turned, and something in my face must have told her more than my words did, because she moved without asking why. The bracing gave 2 seconds later, 140 pounds of steel decking sliding down exactly where she had been standing. It hit the platform below, with a sound like the earth clearing its throat. The site went silent. Then everyone was shouting at once, and Adair Voss was standing very still, staring at the space where she should have been. She looked at me the way you look at a door you didn't know was there. "How did you know?" she said. "The sound," I said. "It groans low before it fails high." Everyone listens for the crack. The crack's too late. Her eyes did something I had never seen them do, not once in 3 years, not in any meeting, not in any teardown of my work in front of 11 silent partners. They went soft at the edges, just for a moment, before the ice came back down over them like a shutter. She smelled, up close for the first time, like gunmetal and winter pine, a scent so cold and so clean it should have frightened me more than it did. "You're transferring to my team," she said. "Effective this morning. Mr. Cole assigns team placements." "Mr. Cole," she said, almost buried under a fire escape. That was the version of the story that went around the firm within the hour, and it wasn't wrong, only smaller than the truth. By 9 a.m., I had a new badge, a new desk on the executive floor, and Emery Cole's smile aimed at me across the lobby like a blade held just out of reach. I didn't understand yet what it would cost him to lose control of that scaffold collapse narrative. I only understood that Adair Voss had looked at me like I was a fact she hadn't accounted for, and that some very old, very careful part of me had started, quietly, to hope. The executive floor smelled like money in a way I'd only read about, cedar-oiled floors, glass instead of drywall, the particular hush of a place built to make you feel small on purpose. My new desk sat 11 feet from Adair's office door. Priya Okafor, her lead engineer, a broad-shouldered beta with 15 years at the firm and the permanently unimpressed expression of someone who had watched a lot of people fail upward, looked at me for a long moment on my first morning. "She's never once given up a corner office view for anyone," Priya said. "You're in it." I looked at the window, floor to ceiling, the city laid out like a circuit board. "I didn't ask for a view." "No," Priya said, "that's rather the point." By the second week, I understood the wealth gap the way you understand weather, not as a fact, but as a temperature change on your skin. My old cubicle building had a water fountain that only worked if you hit it. Adair's floor had a kitchen with an espresso machine that cost, I later learned, more than my father's truck. I ate lunch at my desk out of habit, a granola bar most days, because I'd trained myself years ago not to need much. On the 9th day, a paper bag appeared beside my monitor at noon, no note. Inside was a sandwich from the place 4 blocks over that I'd mentioned once, in passing, to no one I remembered telling. I asked Priya about it. She didn't look up from her screen. She remembers everything, she said. It's mildly terrifying. The insiders sneered the way insiders do, quietly, in hallways, loud enough to be sure I heard. Devin Marsh, Emery's favorite associate, a tall alpha who'd never once had his math questioned in the 4 years he'd worked there, made a point of calling me the temp in front of clients. I let it slide off. I had learned a long time ago that armor works better than arguing. What I couldn't let slide off was the evening I stayed late reorganizing archive files and found, tucked behind a decade of permit records, a yellowed newspaper clipping. Voss Tower collapse claims founder's life, the headline read, and under it, smaller, a paragraph naming the site engineer of record. Emery Cole. I didn't understand yet what that meant. I only understood, holding it, that my hands had gone cold the way they did the day the coroner used my father's dental records instead of his face. Adair found me still holding it an hour later, the office dark except for my desk lamp. "You're still here," she said. "So are you." She looked at the clipping in my hand, and something in her jaw went tight, controlled. The way a door looks controlled right before someone kicks it. Where did you find that? Archive Box 41. I wasn't looking for it. I know. She took it from my fingers, careful not to touch my hand, though I felt the almost of it anyway, a warmth that had nothing to do with the radiator. Ask me about it when you're ready to hear the whole thing. Not the file version. Why not now? Because I've told exactly 2 people the whole thing, and both times it cost me a week of not sleeping. Her voice had dropped, not softer exactly, but truer, the practiced flatness worn thin enough to see through. You get 1 free question tonight. Choose it well. I thought about my father's compass, the stiff hinge, 15 years of not asking anyone anything that might make the ache worse. "Why did you save me first?" I said. "On the scaffold. You could have just told me to run." Something crossed her face that looked almost like surprise at herself. "I don't know yet," she said. "I'm working on it." She was still holding the clipping when she left, and I noticed, the way I noticed everything now, that her scent had shifted while she stood there. Gunmetal and winter pine gone warmer at the edges, like the season had started, almost imperceptibly, to turn. The blow came on a Thursday, in the open floor, in front of 9 people, which was precisely how Emery Cole liked to deliver blows. "I've been reviewing the North Bracing revisions," he said, sliding a folder onto my desk like it was a gift instead of a guillotine. "Interesting how closely they resemble the original specs your father's crew used on the Fenwick job, the ones that failed." The room went very quiet. My father's name had not been spoken aloud at Marlowe and Cole in 3 years of my working there, and hearing it now, weaponized, in Emery Cole's mouth, felt like being struck somewhere with no bruise to show for it. "That's not," I started. "I only mention it," Emery went on, "because instability tends to run in families. Grief, fixation, it's not a character flaw, Miss Ashby. It's simply a liability on a 140-story building." Adair's office door opened before I could answer. She had heard every word from inside it, apparently, through walls I'd assumed were soundproof. "Emery?" 1 word. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "Adair, I'm only raising a legitimate. You raised her dead father in a room of 9 people to discredit a woman who saved my life 3 weeks ago. She crossed the floor without hurrying, which was somehow worse than hurrying. You will not do that again. She works for this firm. I'm a founding partner. She works for me." Adair's voice didn't rise. It never rose. It simply became something you couldn't stand next to. "And you are 1 filed complaint away from a board review you will not survive. Choose your next sentence carefully." Emery chose silence instead, which was its own kind of confession, and left the floor with his jaw locked and his smile finally, briefly, gone. I found Adair in the stairwell 20 minutes later because I needed air that didn't have Emery Cole's cologne in it. She was standing very still with her hand flat against the concrete wall, breathing in a way that looked deliberate, counted. "You didn't have to do that," I said. "I did, actually. She didn't turn around. I've spent 14 years making sure no one could ever say my name and instability in the same sentence. I know exactly what that sentence costs when someone else has to hear it. It was the closest she had come to telling me the whole thing, and I understood, standing there, that some doors open slower than others, and that this was hers opening by a single inch. The storm hit on the night of the final stress test. The kind of storm that turns a construction site into something closer to a shipwreck. Wind gusts strong enough to sway a finished tower were catastrophic for one still open to the sky at 30 stories, and half the crew had gone home before the worst of it, leaving Adair and me on site running emergency numbers on bracing sensors that wouldn't stop screaming. Sector 9's reading unstable. I shouted over the wind, watching a readout spike red on my tablet. If that scaffold shears, we lose the whole east face. Then we don't let it shear. She was already moving, rope and harness in hand, toward the exact kind of height I had once watched steel fall from. Adair, no, Wren. My name in her mouth stopped me colder than the wind did. She'd never used it before. Not once. Always Miss Ashby. A wall she kept between us on purpose. I need eyes on the counterweight from the platform below. Can you do that? Yes, then go. We worked for 40 minutes in freezing rain, calling numbers back and forth, and somewhere in the middle of it, the wall between us came down without either of us deciding to take it down. When the last brace locked and the readouts finally steadied, we were both soaked through and shaking. And she pulled me under the half-finished stairwell out of the worst of the wind, closer than she had ever stood. You could have died up there, I said. So could you. You came anyway. You're my. I didn't know what word finished that sentence. Boss, rival, something else entirely. Say it, she said. Quiet, not a command, not really, though her voice still carried the shape of one. I don't know what you are to me, I admitted, breath fogging between us. I only know I couldn't watch you fall. Her hand came up, slow, giving me every chance to step back. She didn't take anything I didn't offer. Tell me to stop, she said, and I will. Don't stop. The kiss, when it came, tasted like rain and adrenaline and something that had been waiting 14 years to be let out of a locked room. She pulled back first, forehead against mine, breathing hard. I have wanted to do that, she said, since the scaffold. You've had a strange way of showing it. I have a strange way of showing most things. Her thumb moved once against my jaw, careful, like she was testing whether I'd let her keep it there. It's the only way I know that doesn't end in something breaking. That night, she drove me back to her loft instead of my apartment, not asking, only offering, and I said yes, because for the first time in 15 years, I didn't want to be alone with the sound the wind made. Her home was nothing like her office. Warm light instead of glass and steel, a drafting table in the corner covered in half-finished sketches that weren't buildings at all, hands mostly, and once, unmistakably, my own hand holding a pencil. You've been drawing me, I said. I draw what I can't stop thinking about. She busied herself at the stove instead of watching me find that out, which told me more than an answer would have. My mother used to say a building tells you what it needs if you're quiet enough to listen. I used to think that was sentimental nonsense. Then I met you and started listening to everything. I told her about the compass then, the stiff hinge, the 15 years in a drawer. She listened the way she inspected welds, completely, like nothing else in the room existed. When I finished, she was quiet a long moment. My mother's project failed because Emery rushed a foundation pour to hit a deadline and let her sign off on numbers she never got to check herself, Adair said finally. He told the board it was her error. I was 19. I believed him for 6 years before I found the original inspection report he'd buried. Her hands, steady on every drafting problem I'd ever seen her solve, were not steady now. I built my whole career on never letting anyone say I was careless. I never stopped to ask whether being careful was the same as being alive. It isn't, I said. No, she looked at me like I'd handed her something she hadn't known she was allowed to want. I'm starting to understand that. We didn't rush past that warmth into anything more than her hand finding mine across the table, patient, deliberate, and it was, I would think later, the safest I had felt in 15 years, right up until the morning it all came apart. The email hit every partner's inbox at 8:04 a.m., a falsified materials report, my name on the signature line, claiming I had approved substandard rebar for the Meridian Foundation to save cost. I had never seen the document. I had never signed anything remotely like it. But the forgery was good enough that by 8:40 security was standing at my desk with instructions to escort me from the building pending investigation. This is fabricated, I said, showing my actual signed reports to a man who wasn't authorized to care. Someone altered the file metadata. I just need you to collect your things, ma'am. Adair was in a partner, meeting 2 floors up, and didn't know yet. I found out later that Emery had timed it precisely for the 1 hour she'd be unreachable. I walked out through the lobby I'd walked into for 3 years as the ghost, except now people looked. Devin Marsh didn't bother hiding his smile. The security escort held my elbow like I might run, and I didn't, because running would have meant admitting there was somewhere safe left to run to, and in that moment, I wasn't sure there was. I sat in my apartment that night, with the compass in my hands, hinge still stiff after 15 years, and did not answer my phone when it rang. Adair called 4 times. I let it go to voicemail every time, not out of anger at her, but because some very old, very tired part of me had decided that being publicly ruined was simply what happened to people like me, and I didn't yet have the strength to hear her tell me it wasn't true. By midnight, there was a knock at my door instead. I opened it already knowing. "You didn't answer," Adair said. Her hair was wet from rain. She hadn't bothered to wait out. Her mask, the one that had cracked open a little every day for 3 weeks, was fully gone. What was left underneath looked almost frightened. I didn't have anything to say that wouldn't have been ugly. "Say it ugly then." She stepped inside without being asked, which from anyone else would have felt like an intrusion, and from her felt like the only honest thing anyone had done all day. "Ren, I know it's Emery. I've known for 3 weeks he'd try something like this. I should have moved on him before he moved on you." "Why didn't you?" "Because I needed proof, not suspicion, and I was terrified that if I acted too fast on suspicion alone, I'd become exactly what my mother was accused of being, careless with the truth." Her jaw worked. "I chose caution over you today. I will regret that for the rest of my life." I looked at her, soaked and unshielded in my doorway, and felt something in my chest that had been braced for 15 years finally, quietly, begin to let go. "Then help me prove it," I said. "Properly tonight." We spent 3 days in the archive room she had access to, and I understood better than anyone alive, cross-referencing metadata timestamps, permit filings, and the original Fenwick inspection report Emery had buried under my father's name a decade before Meridian ever existed. What we found rewrote everything I thought I knew about the day my father died, the same signature, forged the same way, on the same kind of falsified materials report filed by the same man, 12 years apart, both times to protect a deadline and a margin. My father hadn't cut a corner. Emery Cole had cut it for him and let a dead man carry the blame because dead men don't sue. "He's done this before," Adair said, staring at the 2 reports side by side, her voice gone very quiet and very cold. Colder than I had ever heard it, colder than gunmetal. "He's done this twice. he would have let it kill someone a third time to protect himself. Adair. I said her name the way she'd said mine on the platform, a rope thrown across a gap. Whatever you're about to do, don't let it be the thing that makes you his. She looked at me a long moment, breathing hard, hands braced flat on the table like she needed the surface to keep from doing something neither of us could take back. Then, slowly, the fury banked itself into something colder and far more precise. "You're right," she said. "We do this in the light, where everyone can see exactly what he is." The board convened an emergency hearing 2 days later, ostensibly about the Meridian safety filing, and every partner, every associate, every person who had ever called me the ghost or the temp sat in that room when Adair Voss stood up and played the recording of Emery Cole's own admin confirming, under oath, whose credentials had generated the falsified file at 6:52 the morning it was sent. Then, she laid the Fenwick report beside it on the projector screen, my father's forged signature next to my forged signature, 12 years apart, same hand behind both. The room that had watched me get walked out by security 3 weeks earlier watched Emery Cole get walked out by 2 uniformed officers instead. Nobody smiled this time. Nobody needed to. For what it's worth, Devin Marsh said to me afterward, quietly, not quite meeting my eyes, "I'm sorry, about the temp thing." "I know," I said, and found, a little surprised, that I meant it when I let it go. Adair found me on the same stairwell where she'd once told me caution had cost her 14 years. She didn't say anything for a long moment, just looked at me like she was memorizing something she'd almost lost. "I have been in love with you," she said. "Since a scaffold I don't even remember climbing that morning. And every day since I have been too much of a coward about what that meant to say it out loud where it counted." "You're not a coward. I am about exactly one thing." Her voice broke. Actually broke. The iron line cracking open in front of me the way I had watched her crack open, day by day, for 3 months. I was so afraid that loving someone meant I'd stop being careful, and stopping being careful meant someone I loved would die the way my mother did. And then I watched you get walked out of a building I run, for a crime I know you didn't commit, and I understood that being careful had already cost me everything that mattered, because I let it cost me you for 3 whole weeks. "You didn't lose me. Tell me that again," she said. "Ask me with your words what you want, and I will give you everything I have left. Kiss me," I said, "and then tell me you're not going anywhere. Ask me the second part properly, and I'll show you instead of telling you." "Adair Voss," I said, "are you going anywhere?" "Not for the rest of my life," she said, and closed the distance between us like a door finally allowed to open. The bite, when it came weeks later, in her loft, with every consent asked and answered twice over, her mouth at my scent gland, and her voice low in my ear asking one more time if I was certain, and I told her I had never been more certain of anything, and the bond that snapped into place between us felt like gunmetal and winter pine folding, at last around honeyed almond and warm graphite. 2 scents that had been circling each other for months finally agreeing to share the same room. Emery Cole was disbarred from practice within the year and indicted on 2 counts of falsifying safety documentation, one of them, at last, filed under my father's name and mine both. Devin Marsh testified against him without being asked twice. Priya Okafor told anyone who would listen that in 15 years she had never once seen Adair Voss wait for another person the way she waited, patient as weather, for me. 6 months later, Adair knelt on the observation deck of the finished Meridian Tower, 140 stories up, city spread out below us, like a circuit board finally lit all the way through, and opened a small box with a ring inside it shaped, unmistakably, like a compass rose. "I had it made to match yours," she said, "because I wanted something of ours to have a hinge that never sticks." We married in spring, in the courtyard of the building we'd saved together, Priya standing witness with her arms crossed and her eyes suspiciously wet, and my father's brass compass sitting open on the small table by the vows, hinge finally oiled loose after 15 years, needle turning true for the first time since the day he died. A year on, we stood together on that same observation deck at sunrise, the tower solid and whole beneath our feet, her hand resting warm against the small of my back, the way it did every morning now. The light came up gold across the glass. Somewhere below us, the city that had once made me feel invisible went on not knowing my name, and for the first time in my life, that didn't feel like a wound. It wasn't beauty that made her stop and see me. It wasn't luck, either. It was the plain, unglamorous truth that someone finally looked hard enough, long enough, to notice the parts of me that had been carrying the whole weight all along, and chose to help me carry it instead. That is what being seen actually costs, and what it's actually worth. The end. If a rivalry that finally cracks open into something this tender found its way into your chest the way it found its way into mine, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss where this story's world goes next. I'd love to know in the comments which moment undid you first: the scaffold, the stairwell confession, or the ring shaped like a compass. Until the next story finds you, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you back here soon.